see you.
Writer and consultant Jill Nagel is not afraid to have open and honest conversations about white supremacy. So much so that she's designed workshops to help counsel and coach white people to help them better understand how racism works and how they can actually use their white privilege to make a difference.
Unexamined white supremacy mythology living in our bodies, and I include myself in this, robs us of some of our humanity.
I'm Eddie Robinson, and stay tuned for an unguarded chat with author Jill Nagel. We'll learn more about what triggered her interest in all of this, and if any of her programs and teachings are actually working, especially as we continue to grapple with a country that's still divided, both politically and culturally. Oh yeah, I feel you. We hear you. I see you. You're listening to I See You. I'm Eddie Robinson. A few weeks ago, our staff IT guru sent our team an email stating that there was an ICU listener interested in taking us to another level when it came to discussions and conversations about race and race relations. Now, of course, that's right up our alley. We wanted to reach out to her. We love talking extensively about race and how we genuinely and authentically have fruitful and sometimes difficult conversations about identity, about stereotypes, and how race and racial discriminatory issues have been huge divisive topics as of late, in this era especially, with social awakenings and societal transformations. And so our amazing producer, Laura Walker, reached out to our guest, who's an author, writer, and consultant who facilitates workshops for white anti-racists and other white Americans to help navigate discussions and conversations and leadership around dismantling white supremacy, its mythology, and its impact on race and racial equality. She's been active within a number of online communities, and her work has been published and reviewed in a host of different places. She's currently working on her next book entitled Skin in the Game: How White People Benefit from Dismantling White Supremacy. And here to talk about all of this, we welcome Jill Nagel to the show. Jill, thank you so much for being a guest on ICU.
Thank you, Eddie. I'm so excited to be here. I saw your roster of guests, and I felt humbled and honored to be included among them and to meet you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And we're so honored to have you on our show. And, we want to be sure to mention to our listeners that views on this episode are those of the host, the guests, and may not be shared by ICU staff or Houston Public Media. We'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback about discussions on this episode, and especially when they're focused and centered on race and race relations. So please, as you're listening, don't hesitate to send us an email. The address is talk@iseeushow.org, and let us know where you live and your own opinion about these conversations. And I'm sure, Jill, you've experienced this in your work. I know I have. I personally know people that react this way. When the minute someone hears the word race, you can almost hear the sighs, the grunts, the groans. Here we go again. Those here we go again reactions. People just don't want to deal with the subject matter, right? I mean, does naming race help perpetuate the problem? How do you address those kinds of responses?
Well, when I hear somebody say, and I do hear this, that, well, you're just perpetuating the problem, that we need to focus on our oneness, our common humanity, and by pointing out these divisions, you're making things worse. You're slowing us down. You're part of the problem. So when I hear that, I say, I recognize that mindset. It comes from someone who is invested in denying our country's history of racism. As my partner would say, the Civil War never ended. That it actually continues today in the form of all kinds of practices and attitudes. And the United States of America has yet to reckon with the horrible race-based harms that it has perpetuated. And one of the ways that I work with anti-racists is to respond to this kind of knee-jerk, reactionary kind of response with curiosity. Because I've noticed a pattern, especially on social media, and I follow, whenever a black colleague or LinkedIn connection posts something powerful, I will scan for the inevitable white person who says, basically, why are you making such a big deal out of this? This is part of the problem. Sometimes even much meaner things. Sometimes I'll put words in their mouth. Why do you have to make it about race? The person never said anything about race. All they did was be black. The white person's coming on. So I make it part of my business to intercept and try to take some of the heat off. And what I notice is that most everyone will pile on them, call them a troll, screenshot, something they think is especially stupid or offensive and try to shame them. And I understand this. And at the same time, I don't see transformation. And I sometimes want to do that too, I'll be honest. But I don't see transformation happening from those actions. So I'll try to draw them out. Say, what makes you say that? What did you see? I didn't see her say anything about race. Where did you see her say that? You sound angry. What's making you angry here? And it can be very disarming. Sometimes a person will just kind of skitter away and never hear from them again. They weren't expecting to be engaged with like that. But sometimes the person will open up, and that's where it gets interesting.
And that's fascinating because I think on some level, when they, realize, they want to talk about this, let me get out of here, quick. On some level, that speaks volumes. Right? I mean that there's a fear that's there, and I'm under the impression that they know that they know what they're thinking and what they're saying is really not fair, not authentic, and not worthy of being true to who that person is as it relates to their race, as it relates to their identity.
Yeah, a lot of people who call themselves Christians and practice Christianity, as 65% or so of the United States does, subscribe to a religion that says, love thy neighbor as thyself. And yet, their behavior doesn't support that. The policies that they advocate don't support that. Yet, I think that all of us are carrying around familial trauma, historical trauma, events that happened to us as adults, and that braids with the trauma states that white people find themselves in as a result of white supremacy mythology. And just to be clear, two things I want to be clear about. One is I am in no way comparing the impact of white supremacy on white people to the impact of white supremacy on black and brown people. What I'm doing is I'm bringing it into the room to say white people are hurting too in different ways, and not everybody would say that what they're doing is coming from a place of hurt. But when I see people talking about fear about being replaced and defensive about being white, it's okay to be white. To me, that's a response from a place of unresolved hurt. And I'm very interested in unpacking that so that white people become more whole, more clear, more able to reason, and less apt to do things and advocate for policies that are harmful and fatal to black and brown people.
And that's why I wanted to have you on the show, to give us some insight as to what that means, white supremacy mythology. Explain why dismantling white supremacy benefits white people.
So white supremacy mythology, each of those words is so packed with history and layers that I'm going to take them one by one. So white, as we know, it's not a biological reality. It's not a quote unquote race. There is one race, the human race. However, The category of white was created to privilege light-skinned people of European descent and distinguish them from darker-skinned people of African descent, and at one point from other light-skinned people, but then the line moved somewhere in history. There's a book called How the Irish Became White by Noel Ignatieff that goes into that. So white is shorthand for a socially constructed category that privileges light-skinned people of European descent. That's a stark way of putting it, white. Supremacy means the artificial privileging. I'm just going to hop over to mythology for a moment, because mythology means it's not true. White people are not superior to anyone. I am not superior to you. I'm not superior to my neighbors. We have different strengths and weaknesses, but they're not because of our appearance, our superficial features. So white supremacy, this word supremacy has two different meanings. One of them is, who prevails, who has all the resources, who has the power to say how things are going to go. And white people have had more than our fair share of that, for sure. Supremacy also means superiority to, like inherent superiority. And that's the part that's the mythology. Sometimes people hear me say white supremacy mythology, and they think I mean that white supremacy isn't true, that I'm denying that it exists. No, I'm saying that the basis for our prevalence, for our overrepresentation in power, in value, and being at the foreground of what's considered most meritorious, most trustworthy, most beautiful, most valued, the basis for that is false. So white supremacy mythology refers to the falsehood of the underlying ideology of white supremacy. The fact of our unfair prevalence is unfortunately true.
Talk about how dismantling white supremacy is beneficial.
What I've noticed is that unexamined white supremacy mythology living in our bodies, and I include myself in this, robs us of some of our humanity. It makes us less rational than we would otherwise be. It makes us more defensive. It occludes some of our access to compassion, to capacity for connection, because we're busy defending ourselves. It's okay to be white, right? And it sits differently among different economic classes of white people. There's a book that came out in 2019 by Jonathan Metzl, and it's called Dying for Whiteness: How the Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland. And it's based on the 10-year study that he did of folks in Kansas and possibly adjacent working class and poor whites who found that these policies they advocated for that were supposed to make their lives great again were in fact increasing gun violence, increasing high school dropout rates, increasing suicide, drug and alcohol abuse. It wasn't actually working for the white people, and yet they were clinging to whiteness. And it's what I call, for poor and working class white people, I think a lot of the rage comes from what I call the broken promise of whiteness. We're white, and so we're supposed to get what Donald Trump has. It's no accident to me that he has become this icon of disaffected white working class, like the folks that stormed the Capitol. Like, we're white, so we want to take what belongs to us. And it's so interesting to me, Eddie, if you step back and look at the United States of America like a big dysfunctional family, suddenly everything starts to make sense. Like, how a troubled kid will steal something and then accuse their brother or sister of stealing, kind of preemptively? Well, to say, give us back what's ours, we're standing on stolen land. This is Ohlone land that I'm speaking to you from. Our economy was built in part, on the labor of people that we enslaved. So to be talking about taking back what's ours, is something that, to me, it stems from some unexamined stuff. Also, Along the dysfunctional family lines, let's say you have a nice white family, right? Only dad's an alcoholic. Mom doesn't want to deal with that, so she covers it up. All right, they're pillars of the community. Dad's a deacon at the church. Mom plays the piano in the choir, whatever. And the daughter, who's a cheerleader, she tries to keep things light. Everybody is colluding with this sort of mythology that everything's just fine, even though dad drinks and passes out every night and, maybe gets a little mean with mom. Now, the son becomes more and more withdrawn and then develops a drug problem. Now the whole family's attention goes to the son. Let's call him Brian. And he becomes what family therapists would call the identified patient. And so instead of dealing with the real root of the family problem, the systemic problem, which probably goes back further than dad, but instead of starting with the truth that, well, dad's an alcoholic, Brian gets sent to rehab and everybody focuses on Brian because we can't admit that dad's an alcoholic. Well, in the United States, the folks who storm the Capitol are the Brian. They're acting out this disaffected white rage. And liberal and progressive whites love to point to them as the problem. Those are the white supremacists. It's them. They're the problem. When really we have a problem in the United States of America, and those folks are just the most obvious manifestations of the problem. And if we dissociate ourselves from them and disclaim any connection to, any responsibility for, we're once again using our white privilege to keep ourselves comfortable.
Coming up, we'll chat more with author-consultant Jill Nagel and find out what happened in her life that triggered her interest in race relations in the first place. And what's her approach? How does she conduct these anti-racist workshops? What are some of the exercises and practices that are done to help others engage with those individuals who are different? And then later, we'll dive deeper and ask how she's been able to confront or deal with her own white privilege. I'm Eddie Robinson. A provocative segment of I See You is just moments away. We'll be right back. If you're enjoying this program, please be sure to subscribe to our podcast, I See You with Eddie Robinson. You can hear all the past episodes and be notified when new episodes are released. Also, please take a minute to give us a review or comment. We love getting feedback from our listeners. It's I See You. I'm Eddie Robinson, and we're speaking with author, writer, consultant Jill Nagel. She's with us virtually from the Bay Area, Northern California, and she's here to help us learn more about race and race relations from a white perspective. Jill runs workshops for white anti-racists so that they're able to lead conversations and insight around dismantling thoughts and ideologies around white supremacy. Lots to unpack, but we're just going to kind of slow things down a bit and ask you to help us understand, was there an incident that triggered this anti-racist initiative for you personally? I mean, how did you first become interested in having this desire to learn more about race and the issues relating to social justice? You know, how did this all begin for you?
Well, there were a few different turning points. One of them was growing up with an aunt, a white Jewish woman. Her name was Phyllis Nagel Washington. There's a whole story behind that. And I was a little scared of her when I was a kid because she was so outspoken and opinionated. That as I got older, I came to respect her and love her and appreciate her so much. And at age 19, in 1946, my Aunt Phyllis integrated a segregated bus. And the driver tried to throw her off, called her N-word lover, told her to get off the bus, and she would not get off the bus. And mayhem and love ensued, and the whole bus became friends on this long ride to New York. And that summer, she read 125 books by Black authors, fell in love with the genre, and went on to teach and establish a Black Studies department at Miami-Dade Community College North, where she taught for 25 years. And all along the way, she said, if ever a Black person wants to come take this over, I will gladly step aside. But in the meantime, I want to make sure that this material is available. And one day, a young Black student stood up in class and said, who are you to be doing this? You have no idea what it's like to actually be a Black person. You have this academic knowledge, but you don't have any clue what it's like to live inside of my skin. And she looked at him and she said, you're right. Why don't you come up here and tell us? And so he did. And so for 4 years, the two of them team taught, with her teaching the more academic side of things and him teaching the lived experience of being Black. So Phyllis was a huge influence on me. Coming out as bisexual in college gave me yet another thing to look at the world through and see how I fit in and didn't fit in to things. Even like being bisexual, like the gay community, I was around when the lesbians and gays at Penn became lesbians, gays, and bisexuals at Penn. Wow. I was one of the ones advocating for the B word, so that was influential.
Right. Interesting.
And I've always been interested in oppression in general and how it works, and especially how members of oppressed groups wind up turning around and oppressing each other. That's always been fascinating to me. And I wound up coming to the place where ideology of any kind will not save us. We need to look at how we are with each other and with ourselves. And that's how come I brought in the somatic, the body-based practices to the leadership training and facilitation that I do. Now, my turning point for this era was after Dylan Roof committed the multiple murders of people of African descent in the church worship group that he did. To a person, I saw my liberal and progressive friends calling him a monster, calling for his, I don't remember, punishment, execution, and so on. And something was sitting in me kind of funny, like, wait, we're all part of this same system. How did we produce this person? Then I looked at his mugshot, and I looked at his eyes. And I am the parent of a son on the autism spectrum. And I looked at his eyes, and he kind of looked a little bit like my son. And what I recognized was that glazed over look, Eddie, the look right before my son would have a violent tantrum. And I used to worry that my son was going to grow up and commit not race-based crimes, but violent crimes. I looked at him and I had this moment of, that could be my son. He is somebody's son. How are we, white people, how are we going to solve this problem? This is our problem. And it was at that moment that I had a visceral sense of the collective white psyche and how I was not separate from Dylan Roof. I was part of this collective white psyche that produced his actions. And as such, what was I going to do? How was I going to help mend this broken family?
Now, with someone who has participated in one of your workshops and who's gone through, your sessions, what are some revelations or takeaways that many of them have stated after they've gone through your workshops?
One person came back to me later and said, these techniques are so useful. I use them with my teenage son now. Techniques of slowing down, tuning into oneself, connecting with the other person. In some ways, all problems are the same problem. They're human problems, and they, in a sense, have the same kinds of solutions. So that doesn't surprise me that someone would say that. Other people have been surprised at how much they were carrying inside under their judgments. Like I have people come in who want to make a difference, who can't talk to their Uncle Fred or their friend Susie from high school because it's just too disturbing to see their attitudes. And I like to quote Asia Davis, a wonderful woman of African descent who leads the Human Potential Project, and she and her partner Molly have a group on Facebook called White People Doing Something that last I checked had like 45,000 people in it or something. And in response to white people who say, oh, I don't want to deal with that racist white person, she says, one less racist in your life is not one less racist in my life. Meaning, if you, white person, choose not to talk to your Uncle Fred or your friend Susie from high school, you have done nothing to help me by pushing them away. Now, if you choose to stick around and engage them, that has the possibility for transformation.
It's I See You. I'm Eddie Robinson, and we're speaking with author, writer, consultant Jill Nagel. She's with us virtually from her home in the Bay Area and runs workshops for white anti-racists so that they're able to lead topics and discussions and uncomfortable conversations around dismantling thoughts and ideologies around white supremacy. You know, sometimes it's just hard to get white people to connect with these kinds of discussions. Perhaps it takes another white person to communicate with another white person and to help navigate thoughts and those perceptions that they've had about blacks and other people of color through these discussions that relate to social injustice and the inequities of our time. You know, some people just feel, Jill, like the right thing to do when dealing with racism is to avoid it, just like you just described it. You know, silence is golden. You know, don't talk about it. Silence speaks volumes. You know, but oftentimes that's really not the best thing to do. And I want you to just kind of go over with us your approach.
Well, so one thing that's foundational to my work is something I call being withness. Like the words being and with and the suffix ness, being withness. Like how do we be with what comes up in ourselves when a stimulus hits our system? And most of us don't really know what to do when we're triggered. We just want the trigger to stop, or we fight it, you know, or we hide out, or we try to placate. You might have heard fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, that we have these responses. Most of us don't really know or haven't even thought about what happens to us when we're triggered and how we might manage that. So here comes a nice white anti-racist, and they're sitting on the bus, and the person next to them makes a racist comment. So what happens to that nice white person? They go into reaction. And in all likelihood, they have an interaction with that person that's not transformative, right? They tell them off. Now, sometimes, you know, we never actually know. That's the thing. We don't have a camera trained on that person 24/7. We can't actually know, well, whatever happened to that guy, you know? But we can do things that have more of a statistical likelihood of creating a transformational conversation. We can make a human connection. We can ask them, what makes you say that? You know, we do this thing in the workshops, the beginner workshops, where you can fake it till you make it. You don't have to clear out all of your childhood trauma and figure out how to get completely grounded and be like a total presence Jedi to be able to make a difference. You can step over all your discomfort. You can cock your head and lean in and say, can you tell me more about that? And we practice doing that, and people laugh and giggle because it's so not what we want to say in the moment. So that's one thing, is to be able to engage.
You mentioned something too about body.
Yeah, we slow everything down. So often we'll start one of the beginner workshops with, think of a situation where somebody said something you thought was racist and you had a reaction. And if people can't think of something, we'll give them, we'll make up an example for them. Like, well, you're talking about it, so you're the problem. And we slow down the moment. Like, you can't really do this in real life, but in the workshops you can. You can notice, like, oh my gosh, my heart is racing, my throat is closing up, I'm telling myself this is hopeless, this is never going to work. Nothing I say is going to make a difference. Or some people are telling themselves, what a jerk, what an idiot, I just want to punch them. Whatever it is, we notice what's happening in our bodies and we be with it. There's the being withness again. We notice what we want to say, what we want to do, and then we make a conscious choice of how we actually want to show up. Now, this, of course, is all easier said than done, right? And so we practice it. We practice it so that we actually lay down those neural pathways. We get used to responding in the way that we want to respond, so that the next time something like that happens, we're prepared. We've rehearsed a way to be that could actually make a difference.
You're listening to I See You. I'm Eddie Robinson, and we're speaking with author-writer Jill Nagel. She's a self-acknowledged white anti-racist, and she helps build programs and workshops around helping other white anti-racists and white people in general understand clearer how whites actually benefit from dismantling white supremacy. She's also a consultant that works to help people learn the importance of understanding why and how to talk to people about racist views. I'm curious, Jill, how have you had to confront your white privilege in your own life?
I find it's painful. I feel embarrassed. I feel disgusted. I feel ashamed. I feel curious. Sometimes I feel grateful, if I'm really honest. Like, I'm going to walk through this whole store and probably no one's going to stop me. I'm going to go in here and ask to use the bathroom, and I'm probably going to get a yes because of how I'm perceived. So, and I'm just thinking, my neighborhood's really loud. I want to move. Where can I go? Probably anywhere. Probably anywhere. So, it's like having a passport. White privilege is like having a special ticket. I didn't earn it. So I feel embarrassed about that, and I feel grossed out by the system that confers it to me. And I also feel a huge responsibility to use it. It's not going to go away. I name it where I can. It's paradoxical because, in terms of one-on-one relationships with other people and with other people who aren't white, it's never not going to be there. But at the same time, if it's the only thing we're ever aware of, we're never going to get closest to humans. There's a poem by Pat Parker, Black lesbian identified poet, and I'm not going to get every single word right, I don't think, but it's called something like, "For the white person who wants to be my friend." And the first line is, "The first thing you must do is forget that I'm black. The second thing you must do is to never forget that I'm black."
I love that.
And that to me is the paradox. And I talked with Cleo Monago, who is a public figure of African descent and a colleague of mine. We ran the 22nd Century Leaders Program together, and we've known each other for 30 years. And a lot of what we do is laugh and rib each other and give each other hell, and it's just a very close relationship. And one day I said, "We never talk about our relationship." He's like, "Yeah." And I said, "I'm white." You noticed that, right? And you're black, and you mainly deal with black people, and we both acknowledged was that there's a way that it's not there, and there's a way that it's always there. And the way that it's always there makes me kind of sad. Like, I feel teary as I'm talking about it, because the reason that it's always there is because of white supremacy mythology. No matter how much I work on this stuff, it's just always going to be there. And then the way that it's not there are the ways that, like, we really lean into each other as friends and as colleagues and think things through together, and that kind of disappears, at least for me. Sometimes, like, it doesn't feel like a black and a white person. It feels like two humans. So I noticed that paradox, that, like, the context is always there, our conditioning is always there, and here we both have two red beating hearts.
Coming up, we wrap up our chat with writer Jill Nagel and get some insight as to, are we seeing any real progress with these race conversations despite the divisiveness that still exists in our country? And what's next for her? How does she plan to expand her strategies of anti-racism? And will the people she's looking to reach and transform have the desire and interest to reevaluate their own attitudes and behaviors towards white privilege and possessing this feeling of superiority to others? Follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Send us your feedback and share your own thoughts about what we've discussed on our show page, ISEEUshow.org. I'm Eddie Robinson. Our final segment of ICU happens in just a moment. If you're enjoying this program, please be sure to subscribe to our podcast, ICU with Eddie Robinson. You can hear all the past episodes and be notified when new episodes are released. Also, please take a minute to give us a review or comment. We love getting feedback from our listeners. You're listening to ICU. I'm your host, Eddie Robinson, reminding you here that on this episode, views and opinions expressed are of the host and may not be shared by staffers of ICU or Houston Public Media. We've been chatting with Jill Nagel. She's a writer, consultant, and author from the Bay Area who loves having open and honest conversations about white supremacy. She enjoys having these dialogues so much so that she's designed programs and workshops to help counsel, coach, and even train individuals, couples, and even organizations to better understand how racism works, specifically how white people can actually use their white privilege to make a difference and help them take part in having those difficult conversations about race and identity with other white people in their lives. Jill, thanks again for being a part of ICU. With all this talk about race, it reminds me of an amazing skit done a while back on NBC's Saturday Night Live, namely season 10. I believe it was the year 1984. Comedian Eddie Murphy was featured in a mockumentary, and he disguised himself as a white man with full makeup, the whole thing, walking into stores, riding public transit, masquerading himself throughout New York City.
Slowly I began to realize that when white people are alone, they give things to each other for free.
All in an effort to explore those racial inequities that existed back then. And arguably, if he were to release that same skit today, it would more than likely still be relevant. Are we indeed, Jill, seeing or perhaps feeling anything that's different? Are we making relevant, substantial progress? I guess that's what I'm asking.
I'm really curious what you think, Eddie.
Thanks for asking, because I think about this all the time in the sense of the reactions that I receive when either I'm online or perhaps even when I go home to Mississippi and sort of like listen in, or at least intuitively get a sense of the people that I'm surrounded by. I'll give you an example online. There may be thought processes that I read in comments where someone says, look, we've had a black president. There's 2 blacks on the Supreme Court now. I'm struggling myself. I'm white. There's no white privilege going on here. And to me, when I hear and read these kinds of comments, I try to engage. I try to, really sort of understand where these reactions and these perspectives are coming from. And there's also another notion, Jill, when I go home to Mississippi and visit. I recently was there. I noticed on this home a Confederate flag. And on the flag, it had the statement, "It's not about hate, it's about heritage." This is perhaps an excuse or justification or an exemption to distancing themselves from violence, to distancing themselves from a so-called race war mentality. To me, it sort of feels like things are being ramped up. And, of course, January 6th last year, you look at what is happening as we move on. Have we made any kind of inroads? I think it's very, very slow, but perhaps on some thin, weird level, there still exists a lot of silence from white Americans. And granted, Black Americans, people of color, there is some racism that's going on within all of us.
Yeah, I think because when you have a biracial president and his Black family in the White House, that's going to irk at best and provoke violence at worst in some white people. Jealousy and resentment and that sort of thing. And I think, I know Black people who would say that Obama was not accountable to Black people. And they're saying the same thing about Kamala Harris. And so one of the things that I've learned from Cleo, a lot of times the white-controlled media will allow certain Black people to rise to prominence because they've demonstrated that they will not go too far against white comfort zones. Mm-hmm. Right? And oftentimes that means that they have a white partner. Like, I'm not going to do anything to offend white people. I'm not saying anything against interracial relationships here. Only that, again, to quote Cleo, there are no accidental patterns. If it's a pattern, it's not an accident. Right? If it were an accident, it wouldn't be a pattern. That what looks like diversity can be an artifact of white accommodationism, and who gets allowed to speak, who gets the mic. There can be compromises that are required that are never spoken and sometimes not even conscious. Like I went to Cleo all excited that the show This Is Us has Black on Black love in it, multiple instances, woohoo, And Cleo says, yes, but, the father is, one of the main characters is raised by a white family where he doesn't get to really be Black, and his father is a drug addict and dies, and you don't really see this character's family, until later on. And I think the ways that white supremacy mythology keeps shape-shifting and reappearing as something else is really frightening. I can't keep up with it. I think just when we think, oh, that looks really good, and then you look a little deeper and you go, oh, fish.
Yeah. When you think we've gone, a couple of steps forward, we move 10 steps back.
Yeah.
How does a white individual get past that thinking of heritage, right? What's at play there? Why do you think individuals, just can't or won't seem to walk away from that kind of ideology altogether? They're forever in Vicksburg, right? And, when they say it's not about hatred, it's about heritage. What's going on there?
My first thought when somebody manifests something, an idea, a feeling, is to be with it. Like, I would want to have a conversation with that person. Tell me more about your heritage. What's important to you? What is it like to feel that connection? Are there any places where you hesitate to fully identify? I think that the loyalties are sometimes very intense, well-intentioned, but ultimately misplaced when it comes to the well-being of the individual and of the planet. So I would want to not push someone or insinuate that they should give that up, but want to inquire into it in a slow, spacious kind of way. I'll give you one example. Daryl Davis, you probably have heard of him. He'd probably be a great guest. He is a musician who decided to go and befriend members of the KKK. And he went, he didn't argue, he didn't push on them, he just went and hung out for days, which became weeks, which became months, and eventually more than 200 Klan members turned in their robes. And he was driven by one question, which was, Yeah. How can somebody who doesn't even know me hate me? And so we went in with an open heart, and I think it's that kind of showing up and being with that, if we had, 200,000 white people going and turning to the people in their midst and saying, you just stormed the Capitol without the judgment. Tell me more about what made you decide to do that. Did you get what you wanted out of it? What happened? And to unravel this trauma and these sets of reactions that are living in our bodies. That's what it's going to take, I think, is a slow, present, curious set of multiple conversations over time with multiple people. There's a group called Coming to the Table, and different chapters have different focuses, but one of them that I went to, there's a gentleman of African descent who's a genealogist, and there's a moment in the group where like 6 of the people realized, black and white people realized that they had a common ancestor. And this is happening with a lot of people, especially people from the South who's been in this country. As a Jew whose grandparents immigrated, that's probably not going to be true for me, but people, white people who grew up in the South, there was, frankly, rape, which was not said, but that was what happened, I'm imagining in most cases. But that here are black and white people sitting in the room who are related by blood through a common ancestor.
The concept known as identified patient. You mentioned it earlier, and I thought that was fascinating, but can you explain what that means? What is an identified patient, and how do we learn from those individuals and the incidents that they pertain to?
So, in a family, or in a relationship, the identified patient is the person that everyone in the family system believes is the one with the problem. However, what they don't look at, and what a good family systems therapist can help them look at, is how is this one body expressing the pain and suffering? In Yiddish we call this tsuris, for the whole. What is this one body expressing for the whole? In the United States, we tend to think of other humans, ourselves and other humans, as individuals. We are individual units of production and consumption. We are individual locuses of rights and responsibilities. We don't tend to look at how an individual also is part of multiple collective psyches, multiple intersubjectivities. I am a part of all of the females in the world. I'm a part of all the Jews in the world. I'm a part of all the white people in the world. And so one of the lenses that I look through is in the collective white psyche, what are individuals who are the cops, Derek Chauvin, Dylan Roof, Kyle Rittenhouse, what are those white people expressing for the collective white body? And they're expressing rage, I believe, at the broken promise of whiteness. Because whiteness is a fiction. It's a fiction that people have loyalty to. So, to answer your question, they are the liberal white person's identified patient. That, like in the dysfunctional family, white liberals and progressives are using to avoid looking at the larger problem and their place in it.
It's ICU. I'm Eddie Robinson, and we're speaking with author Jill Nagel about race and race relations from a white anti-racist perspective. Share more insight with us, Jill, as to how you plan to expand your work. What's next for you, as to how you'd like to move forward with initiatives that are designed to help white anti-racist leaders be seen.
I would like to work more directly, one-on-one, with leaders. I think that's where some of the deepest work comes. When Cleo and I finished this leadership program, we both were hungry for that, to get in even deeper with people. I'd like to work with groups who are in the same organization so they can support each other. I'm looking right now at going into synagogues and supporting white Jews who want to make a difference. And in the fall, I will be pitching agents to see who wants to represent my book, Skin in the Game, How White People Benefit from Dismantling White Supremacy.
Fascinating. And as you press on and as you continue your work, Jill, what lessons have you learned about yourself thus far?
That I'm not afraid to cry on camera, and that the more I'm myself and authentically me, which is the only way I know how to be, that opens up space for other people to get real too. That, as has been the case for a lot of my life, I'm saying things that other people aren't saying and that are making some people uncomfortable and others light up.
Well, Jill, I am so grateful that you've taken the time out of your schedule to be a part of this conversation. We've thoroughly enjoyed it. And again, as you continue your journey and building working relationships with white anti-racists and other white Americans, please, by all means, we'd love to have you back on the show and to provide us with more insight, more perspective as things progress. Thank you so much, Jill, for being a guest on I See You.
Thank you, Eddie. I see you too.
I love that. And that's it for this week's show of I See You. Our technical director, Todd Halslander. Producer, Laura Walker. Editors, Mark DeClaudio and John Mitchell Good. I See You is a production of Houston Public Media. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter. And subscribe to our podcast wherever you enjoy listening to your favorite shows. You can also leave comments and feedback, as well as check out previous episodes by visiting our show page, iseeushow.org. I'm your host and executive producer, Eddie Robinson. And I feel you. We hear you. I see you. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time.